The Law of Dependent Arising. The Secret to Bondage and Release. Sermon 3. By Bhikkhu K Ñāṇananda. Narrated by Bhikkhu Candana. Sermon 3. Pahankanuwa Sermon number 185. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage be to the Fortunate One, the worthy, fully enlightened. Ekamulang dviravatang Timalang panchapatharang Samuddang dvadasavatang Patalang atari isi Ekamula sutta Devata Sangyutta. With but one root and turning twice, with triple stain and arenas 5, the ocean with its eddies 12, the quaking abyss the sage has crossed. Dear listeners, in order to understand properly the law of dependent arising, one has to have a deep insight into the interdependence between consciousness and name and form. In the last 2 sermons, we compared this interdependence to a whirlpool. The deepest point in a whirlpool is the abyss. The riddle verse we have taken up today as the topic of our sermon has a reference to an abyss. Let us examine whether there is any connection between the law of dependent arising and this abyss. This is a riddle verse that is found in the Devata Sangyutta of the Sangyutta Nikaya, or Connected Discourses of Lord Buddha. It seems that a certain deity has put together and presented 7 factors in the Dhamma metaphorically as a sustained simile in this verse. First of all, let us try to get the literal or apparent meaning of the verse. Ekamulang dviravatang, having one root and with 2 turnings round. Timalang pancha patharang, with 3 stains and 5 expanses. Samuddang dvadasa vatang, the ocean with 12 whirlpools. Patalang atari isi, the abyss the sage has crossed. Only this difficult riddle verse is found there in that context, within any clue to its meaning. The commentary gives some meanings at random. Though it appears as a difficult verse, the similes alluded to in it are to be found elsewhere in the discourses. To begin with the abyss itself, there is a discourse by the same name in the Vedana Sangyutta of the Salayatana Vagga in the Sangyutta Nikaya. There the Buddha says, "Monks, this is a synonym for painful bodily feelings, namely the abyss. Saririkanang ko etang bhikkave dukkhanang vedananang adivachanang yadidang pataloti." So you all know now what the abyss is. Then as for the ocean, that too we can understand by an open hint in the Samudda Sutta, in the same section of the Sangyutta Nikaya. Chakhu bhikkave purisassa samuddo tassa rupamayo vego yotang rupamayang vegang sahati ayang vucchati bhikkave atari chakhu samuddang sauming savatang sagahang sarakhasang tinno paragato thale titthati brahmano. The eye, O monks, is the ocean for a man. It has the force of waves of forms. Whoever endures that force of forms, he, O monks, is called one who has crossed the ocean with its waves, whirlpools, seizures, and demons. The Brahmin who has crossed over and stands on dry ground on the farther shore. Now what does this mean? The eye is called an ocean for a man. In that ocean there are the waves of forms. Whoever is able to withstand the force of those form waves is called the Brahmin who has crossed over this ocean with its waves, whirlpools, seizures, and demons, and stands on the dry ground, having gone beyond. The reference here is to the Arahant. The discourse goes on to give the same description in regard to the other sense spheres, namely the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, calling each of them an ocean for a man to cross over. The objects of the six senses are called waves. This is an instructive discourse for those meditators whose meditation topic is the six sense spheres. In the ocean, there is the force of form waves. If one gets swept away by them and gets drawn into the whirlpool, one is seized by the form demons. So also is the case of the ocean of the ear. Here the idea of waves is quite apt. One is carried away by sound waves, gets drawn into the whirlpool, and is seized by the sound demons. It is the same with the other senses, inclusive of the mind. In the case of the mind, it is the thought waves. That is a concept relevant to insight meditation. The force of thought waves develops into breakers, which sweep us aloft and drag us into the whirlpool to be seized by the demon. This, by the way, is the important point in the explanation of the sustained simile of the ocean. Then what about the eddies? We need not go in search of other discourses, since it is already implicit here. The word savata with eddies, qualifying the ocean, can be taken as an allusion to the concept of the 12 eddies. Since the discourse speaks of 6 oceans, how are we to count 12 eddies in the 6 oceans? Worldlings regard each of the 6 senses as well as their respective objects as self. That is why, for instance, there is the admonition to regard them as not self, anatta, in developing anatta sanya, perception of not self, as a meditation subject. Example, chakkung anatta, rupang anatta, eye is not self, form is not self. For instance, in the case of the eye, waves keep circling round the eye as well as its object, before one gets drawn into the whirlpool. So much for the 12 eddies. What then are the 5 oceans, pancha paṭṭharaṃ? In the Maradhitu Sutta of the Sagataka Vagga of the Sangyutta Nikaya, we read, Panchoghatinno ataridha chatthaṃ. Having crossed the 5 floods, he has here itself crossed the 6th as well. This is a reference to the Arahant. The 5 floods are the 5 arenas or expanses of sense pleasures. Sense pleasures spread over the arenas of the 5 senses, pancha paṭṭharaṃ, and in so spreading incur 3 stains, timalaṃ, a reference to which can be traced to the Dutiya Samudda Sutta in the Salayatana Sangyutta. Yassarago cha doso cha avidya cha virajita so imang samuddang sagahang sarakhasang sa umibhayang duttarang achatari. He in whom lust, hate, and ignorance have been made to fade away has crossed this ocean, so hard to cross. The ocean with its seizures, demons, and the danger of waves. This again is a reference to the Arahant. Just see how all these fall into place. So you may take lust, hate, and ignorance as the three stains. Then there is the term dviravattam, double turning, or turning between two things. These two we can understand through Salla Sutta in the Vedana Sangyutta. In that sutta, there is this statement about the untaught worldling, asutava putujjano. So dukkhaya vedanaya puttho samano kama sukhang abhinandati tankissa hetu na bhikkave asutava putujjano pajanati dukkhaya vedanaya nissaranang anyatara kama sukha. He, on being touched by painful feeling, delights in sensual pleasures. Why so? Monks, the untaught worldling does not know a stepping out from painful feeling except sensual pleasures. Because he doesn't see an exit from painful feeling other than a recourse to sensual pleasures, the ordinary worldling keeps on turning back and forth between pain and pleasure. That is why we call it a seesawing between these two extremes, due to ignorance about the neither painful nor pleasant, or neutral feeling at the middle. That is to say, for him, ignorance underlies the neither painful nor pleasant feeling, while the latencies to lust and hate underlie pleasant feeling and painful feeling, respectively. Therefore, these three stains keep on growing in him. So much for the turning twice in the riddle verse. Last of all, we come to the one root, ekamulang. Now, what is this one root? That too we can understand in the light of the Passamulaka Sutta, rooted in contact, in the Vedana Sangyutta. There we find the following declaration by the Buddha. Monks, there are these three feelings that are born of contact, rooted in contact, caused by contact, and arisen from contact. What three? Pleasant feeling, painful feeling, neither painful nor pleasant feeling. The clue we need is already there in the title of the sutta, Passamulaka. All feelings have contact as their only root, ekamulang. Although we have offered the above explanation, the standard commentary of the text, which nearly everyone relies on, gives a different interpretation to this riddle verse. We shall cite it, too, for the sake of those of you who prefer to follow it. We explained from the abyss upwards, whereas the commentator explains from the root downwards. Now this is how the commentator explains the term ekamulang. The root causes for the samsaric existence of beings are ignorance and craving. However, for some reason or other, the commentator opts for craving as the root in this context. So remember, according to the commentary, the one root is craving. Then dviravattam, or turning between two things, is explained as the alternation between the eternalist view and the annihilationist view. For the world is said to be turning round between these two extremes. The five arenas are the fivefold sense pleasures, as we also have explained. The three stains are said to be lust, raga, hate, dosa, and delusion, moha, whereas in our explanation, ignorance, avidya, figures as the third stain. The ocean, samudra, is taken to be craving. The 12 eddies are explained as the 12 internal and external sense spheres, which tallies with our interpretation. But then the abyss is said to be craving itself. So it seems, according to the commentary, 3 out of the 7 similes of the riddle verse are to be interpreted as references to craving. You should consider whether the commentarial interpretation is plausible. According to it, the root is craving, the ocean is craving, and the abyss is also craving. Here is a riddle verse with a sustained simile. But the commentary seems to have gone off at a tangent, missing its true significance. The most important term that emerged from our discussion is passamulaka, rooted in contact. It is suggestive of the immense significance of contact. Out of the discourses dealing with the question of contact, the one that brings us the deepest analysis is the Mahanidana Sutta of the Digha Nikāya. So let me now sidetrack to that discourse. This Mahanidana Sutta is of fundamental significance, like the Satipatthana Sutta, and even like it, was preached at the township of Kammasadhamma in the Kuru country. By way of introduction, it is said that once, when the Buddha was staying at Kammasadhamma in the Kuru country, Venerable Ñāṇananda approached him and said, "It is wonderful, Venerable Sir. It is marvelous, Venerable Sir, how deep the law of dependent arising is, and how profound it appears. All the same, Venerable Sir, it appears to me as clear and clear." The Buddha's response was this: "Do not say so, Ñāṇanda, do not say so. This law of dependent arising is deep, and it appears profound. It is through not understanding and not penetrating this Dhamma that this progeny has become a tangled skein, matted like a bird's nest, interwoven like munja and babbaja grass, unable to pass beyond states of woe, bad borns, downfall, and the round of birth and death." From there onwards, the Buddha, like a teacher explaining a deep point to a pupil, clarifies some deep aspects of the law of dependent arising to Venerable Ñāṇananda, who is the treasurer of the Dhamma in this dispensation. As a matter of fact, Mahanidana Sutta is considered by many as an extraordinary and profound discourse. Anyway, let us try to understand it without undue fears. To put it in brief, this discourse has something special to say about contact, which is the point we are concerned with. We have already mentioned that name in name and form comprises feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention, and that form in name and form amounts to the perception of form derived from the 4 great primaries: earth, water, fire, and air. In this discourse, the Buddha explains to Venerable Ñāṇananda, step by step, the mutual relationship between name and form on the one hand, as well as the mutual relationship between name and form and consciousness on the other. The discourse proceeds in the form of a catechism, but for facility of understanding, I shall try to present it in a simplified way. To begin with, let me draw your attention to the special significance of the discourse. As we have mentioned earlier, the traditional way of analysis of the law of dependent arising, which many follow at present, is to start from avidya, or ignorance. However, in the Mahapadana Sutta we discussed the other day, the first 2 links, avidya and sankhara, are not mentioned. In this discourse, too, those two links do not find mention. Instead, what is highlighted here as the basic and most important is this interrelation between name and form and consciousness. Generally, in reciting the formula of dependent arising, we are used to the following order. Dependent on ignorance, preparations. Dependent on preparations, consciousness. Dependent on consciousness, name and form. Dependent on name and form, six sense spheres. Dependent on six sense spheres, contact, and so on. That is to say, between name and form and contact, we expect to get six sense spheres. But apparently, this discourse makes no mention of six sense spheres. Instead, it has a reference to eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and mind contact. Therefore, one cannot say that the six sense spheres are fully omitted from this discourse. Contact is explained with special reference to the six senses, which makes good the apparent omission. The most important feature of this discourse is the exposition of the interrelation between nama, name, and rupa, form. The other day we explained that nama refers to what pertains to the question of recognizing something. There are two aspects in contact, or sampassa, namely, the impact and the recognition of the impact. In this concern, the Buddha explains an extremely subtle point to Venerable Ñāṇananda in a question and answer fashion. I shall try to give the gist of that detailed explanation whereby the Buddha convinces Venerable Ñāṇananda step by step of the rationale of his explanation. The conclusive statement amounts to this. If all those modes, characteristics, signs, and exponents by which the name group, Namakaya, is designated were absent, there would not be manifest any verbal impression, adivacana sampassa, in the form group, Rupakaya. You had better bear in mind that there are two significant terms which keep recurring in this discourse, namely, adivacana sampassa and paṭicca samuppāda. It is these two terms that have puzzled many scholars. In connection with the concept of contact, we find the Buddha mentioning these two unusual terms in this discourse. Out of those two, adivacana samuppāda can be easily explained, since we have associated the term nama with naming. Adivacana is a word connected with the linguistic medium. Adivacana nirutti panyati, synonym terminology, designation, are part and parcel of the linguistic medium. They are helpful in explaining something. So with this concept of contact, there is an aspect of recognition. That is what adivacana samuppāda, verbal impression, means. Then there is also the impact aspect, to denote which the term paṭicca samuppāda, resistance impression, is used. It is to show how these two have a mutually reciprocal relationship that the Buddha first of all declares, as we have stated above, that if all those modes, etc., by which the name group is designated were absent, there would not be manifest any verbal impression in the form group. That is to say, no verbal impression about the form group is possible, if not for the name group. Then, the Buddha goes on to give the converse. If all those modes, characteristics, signs, and exponents by which the form group is designated were absent, there would not be manifest any resistance impression, paṭicca samuppāda, in the name group. Those of you who listened attentively might understand this. If I may give a simile, contact is like the Siamese twins born to the parents, name and form. This is because for the full understanding of contact, both the verbal impression offered by the name group and the resistance impression offered by the form group are essential. That is, as far as the animate world is concerned, and not with regard to the inanimate world. In the animate world, an impact is understood with the help of the constituents of name, feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. What is called form is the four great primaries, which provide the scaffolding for the nomenclature, namely earth, water, fire, and air. A resistance, too, has to come in. On an earlier occasion, we gave as a simile the case of a blind man going and striking against a block of ice. He would come back with a perception of earth. Supposing when he goes there for the second time, the block of ice is melting, he would come back with a perception of water. Next time he goes there, it is boiling. He would return with a perception of fire. If he goes again, when it is evaporating, he might come back with a perception of air. The worldling gets acquainted with the four elements like that blind man, and proceeds to name them according to his impressions. Whatever it is, a resistance has to come in. So then, from the characteristics proper to the name group, the form group gets recognition, and from the characteristics proper to the form group, the name group encounters resistance. But the Buddha goes on to add something more to complete the picture. If Ānanda, all those modes, characteristics, signs, and exponents by which there is a designation of both name group and form group were absent, would there be manifest either any verbal impression or any resistance impression? There would not, Venerable Sir, replies Venerable Ānanda. Lastly, he asks the question which decides the issue. And if, Ānanda, all those modes, characteristics, signs, and exponents by which there comes to be a designation of name and form were absent, would there be manifest any contact? There would not, Venerable Sir. These, then, are the four conclusions. Firstly, it is said that if there were no characteristics proper to the name group, there would not be a verbal impression on the form group. Secondly, if there were not the characteristics proper to the form group, there would not be any resistance impression on the name group. Thirdly, it is said that if the characteristics by which both name group and form group are designated were absent, there would be neither a verbal impression nor a resistance impression. Fourthly comes the culminating conclusion. If there were no name and form, there would be no contact. Then the Buddha goes on to point out another important fact, namely, the mutual relationship between consciousness and name and form. This is the deepest point. Here too, the Buddha questions Venerable Ānanda, convincing him step by step of the point at issue. He puts the questions in such a way that Venerable Ānanda has to reply in the negative. Now this is how the Buddha points out that the presence of consciousness is a necessary condition for name and form. If, Ānanda, consciousness were not to descend into the mother's womb, would name and form be left remaining? No, indeed, Venerable Sir, replies Venerable Ānanda. Now let us digress a little. Some of those Western psychologists speak only about consciousness. They never speak of name and form. Everybody is talking about the moment of death these days. There is so much pep talk about near-death experiences and after-death experiences, NDEs and ADEs. But what the Buddha tells us is that before the dying moment, name and form is already sketched out in a mother's womb. If consciousness does not go there and join it, name and form would not grow. In other words, without the support of consciousness, name and form would not remain in the mother's womb. The next question the Buddha puts to Venerable Ānanda is that, having descended into the mother's womb, if consciousness slips out for some reason or other, would name and form grow up and get born into this state of existence, ittatta? The reply, as usual, is in the negative. The object of the last thought is namarupa, which is indicative of the next birth. It makes an imprint in the mother's womb, like a light shade of the mind, but until consciousness goes and joins with it, there is no animation. Even if consciousness unites with it and animates it, if it slips out during the period of pregnancy, an apparent miscarriage will result. Instead of a child, a lifeless ball of flesh will come out, because consciousness has slipped out due to some karmic reason. Consequently, no being will be born out of that namarupa into this state of existence, or ittatta. When Venerable Ānanda understood this point, the Buddha proceeds to put another question to him. If Ānanda, the consciousness of a boy or a girl, were to get cut off at the young age itself, would name and form come to growth and maturity? No, indeed, Venerable Sir. Another important fact comes to light by this question. What is generally known as namarupa in the world is that which is activated by consciousness, which later is taken for granted as it is invisible. But if consciousness slips out after the birth of a child, it is no longer reckoned as namarupa. It is only a dead body. Having convinced Venerable Ānanda of these three corroborative facts, the Buddha finally draws the conclusion in a very emphatic tone. Tasmāti Ñāṇananda esova hetu, etang nidānaṃ, esa samudayo, esa paccāyo, viññānassa yadidang nāmarūpaṃ. Therefore, Ānanda, this itself is the reason, this is the cause, this is the origin, this is the condition for name and form, namely, consciousness. Thereby, the Buddha convinces Venerable Ānanda of the fact that there can be no name and form in the absence of consciousness. Then he shows that the converse is also true, just by one sentence. Viññānaṃ va hi ānanda nāmarupe patiṭṭhaṃ nālabhisatah api nu ko āyating jāti jārā maranaṃ dukkha samudaya sambhavo paññāyethati. And if, Ānanda, consciousness were not to get a footing on name and form, would there be manifest an arising of birth, decay, death, and suffering in the future? No, indeed, Venerable Sir. Therefore, Ānanda, this itself is the reason, this is the cause, this is the origin, this is the condition for consciousness, namely, name and form. This amounts to saying that if consciousness does not get a footing in name and form, there is no state of existence. There is no question of birth again. What the Arahants have done is to bring consciousness to such a state that it gets no footing on name and form. In other words, it is the state of unestablished consciousness, apatithita viññāna. Having thus clarified the interrelation between consciousness and name and form, the Buddha now makes a very strange declaration of extraordinary depth, summing up this mutual relationship in the context of samsaric existence. Ettavata ko ānanda jāyetha va jiyetha va miyetha va chavetha va uppajjetha va ettavata adivachana patho ettavata nirutti patho ettavata panyatti patho ettavata panyavacharan ettavata vattang vattati ithatang panyapanaya yadidang namarupang saha vinyanena. Insofar only, Ānanda, can one be born or grow old, or die, or pass away, or reappear. Insofar only is there any pathway for a verbal expression. Insofar only is there any pathway for terminology. Insofar only is there any pathway for designation. Insofar only is there any sphere of wisdom. Insofar only is there a whirling round for a state of thisness, that is to say, as far as name and form together with consciousness. The full significance of the whirling round for a designation of this existence, ettavata vattang vattati ithatang panyapanaya, emerges from this declaration. This is the standard quotation, asserting the validity of our simile of the vortex between consciousness and name and form. Namarupang saha vinyanena. It is because of this whirling round, this vortex, that even a designation is possible. The entire problem of existence is traceable to this vortex, and its solution through wisdom is also within this and not outside it. Even the price of an article is dependent on the whirling round of supply and demand. Likewise, it is between these two, that is, name and form and consciousness, that all concepts of a being in existence are at all possible. Perhaps our explanation of phassa, or contact, might not be clear enough for many of you. As usual, let me digress into the world of similes for further clarification. When we speak of contact in the sentient or animate world, the idea of two things automatically comes in, because consciousness discriminates between two things. But what about the insentient or inanimate world? If we throw heavily one big stone on another, even if the other gets cracked, it will not complain. There is no clash. But supposing you accidentally collide with another while walking on the pavement in a rush hour, there could easily be a clash, verbally or even physically. There we see clearly a case of verbal impression, adivachana sampassa, and resistance impression, Paṭicca Samuppāda. Unlike in the earlier instance of inanimate objects, there was no clash, no offense or defense between the two stones. Let us take up another simile, that is, one which carpenters will understand easily. Suppose a carpenter is going to join two planks of wood to fix up a door. He might ask his apprentice to see whether the two planks properly touch each other. Strictly speaking, lifeless planks cannot touch, but the concept of touch is attributed to it in mechanical parlance in various branches of technology. Mechanics even infuse life into the tools and machines they work with. I am told that there is someone inside the computer too. Our delusion of self makes us attribute life into the inanimate objects also. The age of animism and anthropomorphism is not yet over. There was no clash when the two stones collided, but there was a clash when two pedestrians collided. This is enough for one to understand the two aspects of phassa, adhivacana samphassa, verbal impression, and paṭicca samupāda, resistance, impression. The recognition aspect is not there in the case of inanimate objects, but our primitive animistic instinct prompts us to attribute contact and touch to lifeless objects around us, and arbitrarily infuse life into them. The question of contact, phassa, brings us to an extraordinary feature of the Buddha's teaching, which marks it off from all other religious teachings in the world. No other religious teacher could go beyond contact. In the Brahmajala Sutta, the Buddha dismisses all the 62 views with a brief but meaningful phrase, Tadapi phassa paccaya. That too is dependent on contact. The implication is that the Buddha went beyond contact. How did he accomplish this? By his understanding of the law of dependent arising. This itself reveals the special significance of the law of dependent arising. But there are many who call in question our interpretation of Paṭicca Samuppāda by quoting a discourse which has an allusion to the descent into the womb. The discourse they adduce in support of the commentarial three-life interpretation is the Tithāyatana Sutta of the Anguttara Nikāya. The special significance of that discourse is that it relates the law of dependent arising to the Four Noble Truths. Channang bhikkhave dhātūnaṃ upādāya gabbhassa avakkanti hoti. Okkantiya sati namarupang namarupa paccaya salayatanang. Salayatana paccaya passo, passa paccaya vedana. Vediya manassa ko panahang bhikkave idang dukkanti panyapemi. Ayang dukkhas samudayoti panyapemi. Ayang dukkha nirodhoti panyapemi. Ayang dukkha nirodha gamini patipadati panyapemi. Depending on the 6 elements, monks, there is a descent into the womb. When there is a descent, there is name and form. Dependent on name and form, the 6 sense spheres. Dependent on the 6 sense spheres, contact. Dependent on contact, feeling. To one who feels, monks, I make it known thus. This is suffering. This is the arising of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. Now, what are the 6 elements? Earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. Those of you who have read the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta of the Majjhima Nikāya would remember how the Buddha begins his sermon to Pukkasati. Chadhaturo ayang bhikkhu puriso. Monk, this man is made up of 6 elements. That means man is a bundle of 6 elements, not 4. The sutta in question also begins with the words Channang bhikkhave dhātūnaṃ upādāya. Monks, depending on the 6 elements, that is to say, if there is a grasping of the 6 elements before the death of a person, gabbhassa avakkanti hoti, there is a descent into a womb. Since the presence of consciousness is already implied, here we have the same story of interdependence between name and form. This passage is misinterpreted by many scholars and preachers as canonical evidence in support of the commentarial three-life interpretation of Paṭicca Samuppāda. All what the sutta passage in question asserts is that if one grasps the 6 elements, that is to say, as long as these elements are not made to fade away, as stated in the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta, there is a descent into the womb. Okkantiya sati namarupang. When there is a descent of consciousness into the womb, one can speak of name and form. Dependent on name and form, there is the 6 sense spheres. Dependent on 6 sense spheres, contact. And dependent on contact, feeling. Feeling is taken as the turning point to the 4 Noble Truths. Vediyamanassa bhikkhave idang dukkhanti panyapemi. It is to one who feels that I make known, this is suffering, etc. The formula branches off towards the 4 Noble Truths, leading to the cessation of suffering. In this way, the law of dependent arising is conjoined to the 4 Noble Truths. All this shows the immense importance of the law of dependent arising. There are many instances where the fundamental significance of the law of dependent arising is highlighted. Once, Venerable Sariputta brings up a quotation from the Buddha himself to emphasize the importance of the law of dependent arising. Vuttang ko panetang bhagavata yo paticca samuppādang passati so dhammang passati. Yo dhammang passati so paticca samuppādang passati. This has been said by the Fortunate One. He who sees the law of dependent arising sees the Dhamma. He who sees the Dhamma sees the law of dependent arising. If this is so, I wonder how many are there who actually know the Dhamma? It seems, according to the words of the Buddha, that no one can claim to know the Dhamma unless he has understood the law of dependent arising. In the same connection, there is a very powerful peroration by the Buddha asserting in no uncertain terms the cardinal significance of the law of dependent arising. Even the tone of that declaration is so impressive that I shall try to quote it in full. Katamocha bhikkhave paticca samuppādo jati paccaya bhikkhave jaramaranang uppadava tathagatanang anuppadava tathagatanaṃ thitavasa dhatu dhammathitata dhamma niyamata idappacchayata tang tathagato abhisambujjhati abhisameti abhisambujjhitva abhisametva achikhati deseti panyapeti pathapeti vivarati vibhajati uttani karoti passathati chaha. What, monks, is dependent arising? Conditioned by birth, monks, is decay and death. Whether there is an arising of Tathagatas or no arising of Tathagatas, that element does persist. That stability of the Dhamma, that norm of the Dhamma, the specific conditionality, that the Tathagata awakens to and intuits into. Having awakened to it and intuited into it, he explains it, preaches it, proclaims it, reveals it, analyzes it, elucidates it, and says, "Behold." This declaration shows the greatness of the Buddha as a peerless teacher, in that he explained, analyzed, and elucidated such a deep Dhamma in a way that we can understand and see for ourselves in our experience. The specific conditionality between any two links of the formula is called Paṭicca Samuppāda, as evidenced from the following quotation. Avijja paccaya bhikkave sankhara ya tatra tathata avitabthata ananyathata idapaccayata ayang vucchati bhikkave paticca samuppādo. Conditioned by ignorance, O monks, are preparations. That suchness therein, that invariability, that not otherwiseness, that specific conditionality, this, O monks, is called dependent arising. All these declarations make it clear that this specific conditionality is an invariable law, true for all times, whether the Tathagatas arise or not. This is a lion's roar, proclaiming the greatness of this eternal law. Having come across such a Dhamma, we should not shrink from it, saying that it is too deep for us to understand. Without understanding it, one cannot be a stream winner. That is why even the poor leper, Suppabuddha, when he became a stream winner, is said to have got the insight into the law of dependent arising. Nowadays, a meditator has to get a certificate from the meditation center as proof of his attainment. All that was not necessary in the past. The sum total of the insight of a stream winner is expressed in the following words. Yankinchi samudaya dhammang sabbangtang nirodha dhammang. Whatever is of a nature to arise, all that is of a nature to cease. As we explained the other day, the underlying principle of the law obtains between any two links. One must understand the difference between the law and its illustrations. There is a lot of confusion in this regard. The Buddha would cite just two links, as in this instance. Avijja paccaya sankhara, conditioned by ignorance, are preparations, and emphasize the invariability of this law. Or else he would say, Jati paccaya jara maranam, conditioned by birth is decay and death, and assert the eternal validity of the law implied by it. What is required is the seeing of this law in one's experience, and not the recitation of the formula. To break up the formula into three parts as applicable to three lives is to make the confusion all the more confounded. And this, despite the fact that Dhamma is declared to be visible here and now, sanditthiko, and timeless, akaliko. It is with reference to this life itself that the Buddha presented the solution to this problem of suffering. There is no need to refer ignorance to a past life. Many scholars are puzzled by the non-mention of ignorance in the Mahapadana Sutta and the Mahanidana Sutta. Apparently, both avijja and sankhara are missing in these two discourses. But all the same, they are implicit there in the discussion of Paṭicca Samuppāda. The non-understanding of the interrelation between consciousness and name and form itself is avijja. The going round, the whirling round, resulting from that ignorance is sankhara. So then, one cannot say that those two links are overlooked. The Mahanidana, or the great cause in the Mahanidana Sutta, refers to the interrelation between consciousness and name and form. There is so much talk these days about the consciousness of a person at death, but very few talk about name and form. The Buddha has clearly explained the interdependence of these two in his sermons on dependent arising. It is a case of a vortex or a whirlpool. Then what about the freedom from this state of affairs? In the verse which forms the topic of this sermon, it is said that the sage has crossed the abyss. Pāṭalaṃ atari isi. What is the significance of this statement? We have explained that the abyss refers to the painful bodily feelings. Bodily pain is the deepest, inescapable aspect of suffering. But the Arahants have come out even from that abyss. On an earlier occasion, we described how Venerable Dabba Mallaputta, an Arahant, set fire to his own body at the moment of Parinibbāna. It is not a case of rash self-immolation. That was after he attained to Arahattapala Samāpatti. The extraordinary feature of that concentration is that, while in it, one is free from all feelings. It is a well-known fact that Nibbāna is called avedayita sukha, unfelt bliss. Once, when the Venerable Sariputta declared, "Friends, this Nibbāna is bliss. Friends, this Nibbāna is bliss," Venerable Udayi asked him, "What bliss is there, friend, where there is no feeling?" His reply was, "This itself, friend, is the bliss therein, the fact that there is no feeling." This is because all three grades of feeling, pleasant, painful, and neither painful nor pleasant, are reckoned as suffering in the last analysis. Crossing the abyss, or to get over painful bodily feelings, is to attain to that concentration peculiar to Arahants. While in that state, the mind is said to be animitta, signless, appanihita, undirected, and sunya, void. Alternatively, it is called appatithita, vijnana, unestablished consciousness. Earlier, we spoke of consciousness getting established in a mother's womb. It is then that the concept of a person is valid. But the highest aim of this dispensation is to reach that state where consciousness does not get established. That is freedom. That is the emancipation of the mind. This emancipation of the mind is presented in various ways in various discourses. Now that we have mentioned about the 6 elements, let us briefly examine how the Dhatu Vibhanga Sutta approaches the problem of emancipation. Here we are given a method of making the elements fade away, virajeti, from the mind, a sort of erasing from the mind. How can one erase them? These elements are there because of measuring. In our writings about meditation on elements, we have pointed out, with special reference to Venerable Sariputta's sermons, that earth, water, fire, and air are drawn on our minds due to experiences obtained through name and form. It is a case of measuring. To do away with this measuring, Venerable Sariputta recommends an elemental meditation: head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, etc., representing the internal earth element. It is the same with the external earth element in point of solidity. Compared with the larger earth element outside, the internal earth element is puny and insignificant. By constant reflection on those lines, the mind is made to get disenchanted with the earth element, thereby making it fade away from the mind. It is a mind liberated from the 4 elements that does not take birth in a mother's womb. On the other hand, so long as the grasp on the 6 elements is there, there is a descent into the womb, as mentioned above. Having grasped the 6 elements, or depending on the 6 elements, there is a descent into the womb. Only so long as there is a grasp on these elements can one speak of a birth in a mother's womb. Along with birth goes the whirling between the two. That is why we spoke of a vortex on an earlier occasion. A vortex can be recognized only so long as there is a whirling round. If one stretches one's arm towards the open sea, saying, "There, there," others cannot guess where he means unless there is a vortex. Where there is a vortex, one can point out a spot in the sea. Similarly, every being is a samsaric vortex. In the previous sermon, we explained how a vortex is formed and how it ceases. Let us try to understand this formation of a vortex from another point of view. As you know, there is a word in common usage in referring to the body, namely, upadinna. This is a term variously interpreted by scholars. Upadinna means what is grasped. It actually refers to that which is grasped at the dying moment, the grasped par excellence, so to speak. That is what we try to protect at all costs. Isn't it the tiny speck of mud, kalala, in the mother's womb, that fetus which we grasp as the first thing in this life? We grasp it with such tenacity that it is called gabha or garbha in Sanskrit. Its growth inside the womb is not simply due to the mother's care and caution. It is largely due to the tenacious grab of the child. All this is because of the whirling round between consciousness and name and form. What we call beings are so many whirlpools in the ocean of samsara. This organic body, as the grasped par excellence, upadinna, represents that which has been grasped as internal from the four elements outside. All our efforts are directed towards the protection of this organic combination of elements. The disturbance of the humors is also symptomatic of our struggle to preserve this organic combination intact. That clash on the pavement gives a hint to the danger of possessing this conscious body. Birth, decay, disease, death, and all the abysmal pains arise out of this samsaric vortex. That is why the Buddha told Venerable Ñāṇananda, "It is through not understanding and not penetrating this Dhamma that this progeny has become a tangled skein matted like a bird's nest, interwoven like munja and babbaja grass, unable to pass beyond states of woe, bad borns, downfall, and the round of birth and death." This tangled problem the Buddha successfully solved by pointing out that there are two aspects of contact called adivacana sampassa and paṭicca samuppāda. He also pointed out that in relation to contact there are two things, name and form, and that there is a mutual relationship between consciousness and name and form. Finally, he showed how consciousness is made non-manifestative. In our earlier sermons, we pointed out that name and form is like a reflection on consciousness. It is like a blind man's impression of a block of ice he strikes against through feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. Wordlings arouse greed, hate, and delusion based on that impression, making the tangle all the more tangled. With this body, born of one's past karma, one breaks the 5 precepts, comes into conflict with the world, just for the sake of protecting this body, and goes on amassing defilements, thereby precipitating a continuity of the vortex. But what did the Arahants do? They aroused wisdom in regard to the interrelation between consciousness and name and form, since in the last analysis that is the proper sphere for wisdom, as the term paññāvacaraṃ in that key passage implies. If one rightly understands that interrelation through the path of practice outlined by the Buddha, and frees the mind from the four primaries, earth, water, fire, and air, as well as from feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention, one attains to that state of emancipation of the mind known as anidassana vijñāna, non-manifestative consciousness, or appatiṭthita vijñāna, unestablished consciousness. This is the end of bhava, or samsaric existence, which the Buddha has made known to the world. So then, bhava does not mean a place of existence, as the world is prone to believe. It is an existence dependent on grasping, upadana. There is another term used to indicate this kind of bhava, namely iṭṭhata. This term, too, is a problem to many. Iṭṭhaṃ means in this way. Iṭṭhata is thisness, or this state of existence. Iṭṭhata is in conflict with aññātābhava, otherwiseness. Thisness is all the time turning into otherwiseness. This is the tragedy of existence. Iṭṭhabhavaññātābhava, which the Buddha lays bare in the following verse in the Dvayatānupassana Sutta. Tanhā dutiyo puriso dighamadhāna saṅsāraṃ iṭṭhabhavaññātābhavaṃ saṅsāraṃ nāti vattati. The man who has craving as his partner, literally second, and keeps going round for a long time, does not transcend this samsara, which is an alternation between thisness and otherwiseness. The worldling, allied to craving, who keeps wandering in samsara for a long time, cannot get beyond the duality of thisness and otherwiseness. The worldling, allied to craving, who keeps wandering in samsara for a long time, cannot go beyond the duality of thisness and otherwiseness. The moment he grasps a state of existence as a thisness, it becomes subject to otherwiseness. This is what is called impermanence, the inexorable tragedy of the conceit of existence. Life is a vain struggle to withstand otherwiseness. It is the vortex that sustains iṭṭhata, and the vortex is the outcome of ignorance and craving. From another point of view, it can be attributed to the four perversions, vipallasa. Impermanence is the nature of the world. But there is a perception of permanence in the impermanent. Also, there is a perception of beauty in the repulsive, a perception of pleasantness in the painful, and a perception of self in the not-self. The vortex is kept up by these four perversions. Having followed the Noble Eightfold Path and developed concentration and insight into the three characteristics, impermanence, suffering, and not-self, one gets dejected with the five aggregates of grasping and attains emancipation. One can experience that non-manifestative anidassana state of consciousness. Thereby, one would be fully convinced of the fact that bhava has ceased here and now. Because of that conviction, one is no longer qualified to be born, since name and form has slipped out. It is in view of this possibility of freedom from rebirth that the Buddha addressed the following question to Venerable Ñāṇananda in the Nibbāna Sutta. Vijñānaṃ vahi ānanda nāmarupe patiṭṭhaṃ nālabhisat apinuko ayating jatijara maranaṃ dukkha samudaya sambhavo panyayetha nohetang bhante. If Ānanda, consciousness, were not to get a footing on name and form, would there be manifest an arising of birth, decay, death, and suffering in the future? No, indeed, Venerable Sir. So then, you have listened to an analysis of a very important discourse today, the Mahānidāna Sutta. It is only by way of introduction that we brought up the Ekamula Sutta. You should not regard all this as mere academic stuff meant for scholars. We invite you to make use of this knowledge of the law of dependent arising in your practice, with the aim of understanding the Four Noble Truths. It seems today also, as usual, many of you have observed the higher precepts. Others too have listened to this sermon, which is directed towards Nibbāna, established on some precepts. May you all strive on diligently to attain the goal in this very life. Whatever beings there are, from the lowest hell to the highest Brahma world, may they all rejoice in this sermon. May it conduce to the attainment of their aspirations. May they all realize the deathless Nibbāna. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.